Egypt recently marked 2 years since the start of the revolution that toppled 30-year President Hosni Mubarak. But people are far from satisfied, and the anniversary was met with severe street protests across the country.
Egypt's new government, dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, is facing a popular backlash. Critics say a new constitution backed by President Morsi fails to protect human rights and to curb the power of the military.
VOA's correspondent in Egypt is Elizabeth Arrott. We turn to her for more on this latest unrest. Let's take a look.
The biggest violence that we're seeing is in a city called Port Said in the north of Egypt. And the violence there was affected largely by a ruling on a football riot last year. And some of the Port Said fans were sentenced to death because of this riot. That brought out a lot of young, angry men on the street in a much more violent and confrontational challenge to the police, including being armed. And so that has taken a very violent element that has not really been seen before.
Well, you've mentioned, Elizabeth, about the tensions that exist in Egypt between the secular segments of the society and the more traditional Islamists in the new government. Tell us a little bit about that. Is that a part of what's going on?
I think what we've seen is just a general reassessment of where Egyptians stand 2 years after the revolution. And I think there's a lot of disappointment. People thought that this would usher in a sort of greater economic prosperity and social justice and a lot of things that 2 years on have not happened. And a lot of people are blaming the Muslim Brotherhood, who have largely taken leadership roles in politics, the presidency, parliament. And without seeing them make these concrete, perhaps quick fix, just anything really to show an improvement in their daily lives, it has really exacerbated the tensions between the majority of non-political, non-religious political groups and the Muslim Brotherhood. On top of that, of course, 2 months ago when the Brotherhood pushed through a no constitution, that also really, really bothered people and thought that that was not a democratic process.
Now, Elizabeth, with the initial uprising, what we saw a lot of participation by young people. We saw a huge movement on social media, which was really unprecedented. Are we still seeing the same groups participating now in these protests?
It is perhaps less broad-based than it was 2 years ago. Again, angrier, but less people are taking to the streets, and certainly the mood is less joyous. You don't see the families that came out. For one, it's more dangerous. We've seen rioting here in Cairo as well. And so people, and unfortunately, a huge uptick in rape, sexual assaults of women on the square. So it's got a very different feeling. Now, that doesn't undercut the amount of discontent people are feeling around the country. But how it's to play out, people are tired of perhaps the consequences of these street protests. It means that less tourism revenues coming in, less foreign investment, and for some people, they may be mad at the Brotherhood, but they're willing to give them a little bit of a chance to at least settle down and try and improve some of these basic conditions. So it's really split. They may be, one hand really liking the revolution, but thinking that they have to sort of just move ahead at this point.
From your vantage point, Elizabeth, you're there on the streets talking to people on the ground. What do you see? I mean, what do you think is the future of Egypt?
Well, that's the big question right now, and certainly some people are concerned, or at least warning about an incredible polarization. I think one of the things about Egypt, and people always talk about it as a fairly moderate country, that you might not see the kind of extremes that we have seen in Libya or Syria or Iraq. Never can predict these kind of things, but there is a sense of moderation that even though we're seeing these clashes, it's a very large country, it's 80 million people or more, and these do involve, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands at their most. So it's not representative of everybody, and I do think there is a great desire just to see some basic improvements in daily life, and people will be willing to work toward that.
And Elizabeth, what are the potential consequences across the region if, as some Egyptian officials have warned, the state collapses because of this new wave of protests?
Look, and I think when the army said that, it was more just a warning that really everybody settle down. And again, I think that might reflect a large part of Egyptians' general sentiment on this, that this is only hurting Egyptians. Now, obviously, if it did fall apart, it would be disastrous for the region, and Egypt obviously as well. It is the largest Arab country and has been traditionally sort of the center of politics and kind of a neutral player when we look at the other regional tensions between Sunnis and Shiites, especially across the Gulf, including Iran. That Egypt has been sort of an honest broker to some extent in that, as well as being a key player in regional relations with Israel, being the first one to recognize Israel and continuing with the peace treaty. So obviously the consequences would be huge. Again, I don't know how many people are thinking that's seriously a possibility, at least at this stage.
VOA's Elizabeth Arrott in Cairo. Thanks again to Elizabeth for her reporting.